You are listening to Medscape's In Discussion series on psoriasis, a podcast where thought leaders and clinical experts share their diverse insights and practical ideas for optimizing patient care. This series is hosted by Dr. Stephen R. Feldman, editor of the Journal of Dermatological Treatment and professor of dermatology at the Wake Forest University School of Medicine in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Relevant disclosures can be found with the episode show notes on medscape.com or the Medscape app. The topics and discussions are planned, produced, and reviewed independently of advertisers. This podcast is intended only for healthcare professionals.
Hi, I'm Dr. Steve Feldman. Welcome to Medscape's In Discussion series on psoriasis. This is episode 6, the final episode of our 3rd season. Today, we'll discuss one of the more important issues in psoriasis management, the use of new and novel topicals for psoriasis. The vast majority of people with psoriasis have only limited disease and can be treated with topicals. When we use internal medicines to control the disease, we often give patients topicals to use on the worst spots. To speak to us about topicals for psoriasis, we have the former chair of the medical board of the National Psoriasis Foundation. Expertscape.com ranks her among the top 3 experts in the world on psoriasis. She's a professor and chief of dermatology at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she is an internationally renowned dermatologist and clinical researcher in inflammatory skin diseases, including psoriasis, atopic dermatitis, and hidradenitis suppurativa. She also serves as co-director for network resources at the UCLA Clinical and Translational Research Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. April Armstrong to In Discussion.
Hello, Steve. Thank you so much for having me here. My goodness, I feel like I need you to announce my morning awakening alarm clock every morning, and I would know that I would have a great day.
I read the Dale Carnegie book on how to be a better presenter, and there's a whole section on giving an introduction talk. So let's talk about topical treatment. Let's start with some of the basics of topical treatment. We have a lot of older drugs. Maybe we could talk about why we even use topical treatment in psoriasis.
For many of our patients who may have limited psoriasis, oftentimes the topical therapies are still the first line for their psoriasis. And we have a lot of innovations in our space right now, but it's also important to remember some of our tried and true oldies but goodies that we have. I know we have different levels of learners here. There are about 7 different classes of topicals, and they're divided into topical corticosteroids, which many of us use for limited psoriasis, especially on non high impact areas. And also, there's topical vitamin D analogs, which is a nonsteroidal and can be used to oftentimes supplement the regimen. We have seen topical calcineurin inhibitors, which include tacrolimus and pimecrolimus. Also, in terms of nonsteroidals, they were among the first wave of nonsteroidals that we have adopted for our patients with a limited psoriasis and can be used in those high impact areas such as the face or the genital regions. And then we also saw retinoids, such as topical tazarotene, being approved for psoriasis. And those are really agents that we can use occasionally, especially for those very thick plaques where we really want to get through those scales. And along with retinoids, we have a class called keratolytics. And those include, for example, salicylic acid or urea containing preparations and alpha hydroxy acids. And they can also help really break down the scale a little bit and then allowing, for example, some of the other topicals to penetrate through. And maybe later on, we can talk about some of our newer classes of topicals that have been introduced into the market during the last 5 years. And those include topical PDE4 inhibitors such as roflumilast and aerohydrocarbon receptor agonists such as tapinarof.
I think the efficacy of topical treatments may be underappreciated. I think give people systemic prednisone and most inflammatory diseases are going to melt away. Clobetasol, probably the most common steroid we use topically, is like what, 5 times more potent than prednisone. And it's just a ridiculously potent drug. And we're able to use it because when you use it topically, you minimize a lot of the side effects that would happen if you were to give it systemically. Even the fastest acting biologics don't get people almost clear at the rate that topical steroids would when the topical steroids are used.
Yeah, the topical steroids, certainly the class 1 topical steroids, when used locally, can be quite effective. And the systemic therapies really help patients with more moderate to severe disease in whom it can be very inconvenient or impractical to put on topical agents over a large body surface area. And I think this also brings up an important point, Steve, that when we're thinking about especially class 1 topical steroids, such as, for example, clobetasol or betamethasone dipropionate, the American Academy of Dermatology and the National Psoriasis Foundation does have a recommendation in terms of the maximum use of class 1 topical steroids in adults. And that is currently at not exceeding 50 grams per week by the guidelines for adults. So I think when we're thinking about the use of topical steroids, especially class 1, where people are likely to have a higher risk of developing skin atrophy when used long term, I think there are some guidances around that to kind of help us to manage patients with this. So oftentimes intermittent use of class 1 topical steroids on the appropriate areas, so non-facial, non-genital areas are important, non-flexural areas, and substitute with either a mid or low potency topical steroids or non-topical corticosteroid agents when appropriate.
The drugs that we use topically can be extraordinarily effective drugs, potent drugs, and the side effects are minimized by putting them on local areas, but there are still disadvantages. You mentioned atrophy, boy, and then there's the potential for systemic effects if one were to use those super high potent ones over a long period of time, maybe some ocular
Yes.
things, acne.
Yeah, and I think those are great points to kind of point out. Also, for pediatric populations, some of the special considerations is that they are at some of the increased risk for systemic absorption, which could potentially put them at risk for example, HPA axis suppression with long-term use of high potency topical steroids over a long period of time. And as you said, also uncommon side effects such as glaucoma or cataracts with use around the eyes. So those are some of the things to be aware of, and especially, I think we do pause a bit in our pediatric patient populations who may have increased skin surface to body mass ratio.
So the newer drugs that you were mentioning, do they address some of these limitations of the older agents?
Yes, so we have newer agents that are non-steroidal, and they really help to kind of address some of these considerations. So one of the key things is that they have not been shown to, for example, increase the risk of skin atrophy, and also it avoids some of the serious risks of long-term class 1 topical steroid use that we just talked about. The new agents that have been FDA approved in the US include tapinarof, which is used once daily, and it's approved for adults with plaque psoriasis who are 18 years and older. And then we also have roflumilast cream that is at 0.3% that is approved for children who are 6 years and above, as well as adults so who have plaque psoriasis, including those with the intertriginous areas. And what we found is that, first of all, those two nonsteroidals, newer nonsteroidals, they do not have a limitation in terms of how much that you can put on in terms of the body surface area. That's important to know. Those two agents have also been actually approved in atopic dermatitis as well recently, something that's good to know for our audience who may treat both psoriasis and AD patient populations. The mechanism for these is a bit unique. So with tapinarof, for example, it's an aryl hydrocarbon receptor agonist. And what that really means is that the molecule goes inside the cell and it can bind to other molecules and it goes into the nucleus and affect the gene transcription. And some of the downstream consequence of that include decreased Th17 cytokine, which is why it's approved in psoriasis. It can increase some of the antioxidant activities, and it can also decrease Th2 cytokines, which is also why it's used in atopic dermatitis as well. And we found about 40% of the patients in the clinical trials for tapinarof achieve about PASI 75 by week 12. which is, I think, quite promising. I think the main side effects for potentially for tapinarof is rare like keratosis pilaris appearing in some patients. It's not too common and it's manageable, and many patients can still continue with the medication.
Super. I was never very excited about tar as a treatment for psoriasis, one of the old-timey drugs, in part because I didn't know how it worked. Then tapinarof comes along and shows that being an aryl hydrocarbon agonist can make psoriasis better. And it's like, if I'm not mistaken, it's the only drug I know how truly for sure how it works. If you put it in an aryl hydrocarbon knockout mouse, the tapinarof doesn't work anymore. So it's been proven that it's working through that mechanism. But it turns out tar works the same way.
Yeah, that's very interesting point. Tar does have a lot of other ingredients that are not great for our skin. So I think the ability to really figure out that the aryl hydrocarbon receptor mediated downstream effects are responsible for much of what we see in plaque psoriasis and really kind of hone in on that mechanism without the potential side effects of that tar can potentially incur on our skin is definitely one of the innovations here. And with tapinarof, it's approved for children in atopic dermatitis. So the approval age is a little different for plaque psoriasis, which is 18 years and above at the current time for atopic dermatitis of any severity. And the good thing is that we have the other nonsteroidal topical, which is roflumilast, which we can talk about as well.
It may be that the tar's rate limiting step with some of those other skin side effects. I think it was the smell and the side effects on your clothing that were like major limiting factors for that drug.
Yes, yes. Yeah. If something doesn't smell good, guess what? People don't want to put it on, and people don't want may not be so thrilled to be around them either.
Super, you mentioned roflumilast, and you said it was approved for children down to the age of what?
6 at the 0.3% concentration. And we actually saw pretty similar efficacies in the clinical trials. By week 8, around 42% of the patients achieving clear, almost clear in their plaque psoriasis response. And the label also include that you can for indications that you can include it, you can use it in intertriginous areas. I shall say both topical tapinarof and roflumilast can be used for intertriginous areas. I find that roflumilast very gentle for those areas and is something good to consider, especially when you have patients with intertriginous psoriasis.
I was talking to a dermatologist, and he was discussing one of the atopic dermatitis nonsteroidal drugs, topical ruxolitinib. And he was saying that despite the clinical trials showing that it's more effective than triamcinolone, in his hands, it was not as effective as triamcinolone. He was disappointed with the efficacy in clinical trials. I'm pretty sure it has something to do with adherence to treatment. And I'm wondering, in your experience, is the clinical efficacy of tapinarof for roflumilast, is it up to what we saw in the clinical trials when you look in real life practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that when I prescribe them to my patients, what I see in the real world that it is pretty close to the clinical trials. And I think one of the reasons is that they are both QD dosing, once daily dosing. So I think that may have some to do with it. By the way, I wish I had that enthusiastic intro for you, Steve, because you are really the father of medication adherence in dermatology, and you've done those classic studies where people opening these jars or tubes without knowing that they're opening to track their adherence. And I think that for medications that are BID dosing, there's definitely more challenge in terms of adhering to that regimen compared to, let's say, QD dosing, which I think in general, when we look at topical therapies, could have a better adherence for our patients.
So, are these topicals replacing the internal medicines that our patients see being advertised on TV?
The ones that are use systemic medications, those are currently approved all for moderate to severe plaque psoriasis, with the exception of apremilast, which is approved regardless of disease severity for psoriasis. So I think when we're looking at this, topical therapies are typically still used in one of two fashions. And number one, in patients with limited psoriasis involvement, and number two, as adjunct to systemic therapies for patients who have moderate to severe disease. So, for example, a patient may be on a biologic and they may be doing very well in the beginning, and then over time maybe there's a little bit of decrement in the efficacy. They notice a little bit spot coming back on the legs. Usually, if the area that's returning is limited, they're overall still very happy about their condition. They can essentially supplement it with some topical therapy on those limited areas that they see. And then patients will still overall in that combination therapy scenario, hitting, let's say, the NPF target of 1% or less. And in general, they will still be quite happy. Of course, if that area expands and putting on topicals becomes more inconvenient, then we want to definitely think about possibly switching the patient to another systemic therapy.
We haven't talked about the combination products that are available. What would you say?
Yeah. Yes, they have been the new development for a very long time. And when we look in the last 10 years, there have been a few new development in that area. The combination therapies are interesting and quite elegant because they allow two ingredients that will be incompatible based on their pH profiles to coexist harmoniously. It's kind of like taking two parents who may not get along, but it's a wedding time and then they have to sit next to each other. And so for a very long time, we would have these anhydrous or oil-based formulations where you can actually put betamethasone, which lives happily in a basic pH, and combining with that with calcipotriene, which lives in the more, for example, a different pH zone to kind of put them together. Excuse me, the betamethasone being more acidic, having acidic, and calcipotriene more having basic, and putting them in the same environment, and they would be okay. The problem with that is that they couldn't make it so it's an aqueous form. Like they couldn't make a cream formulation of that. So as a result, there has been some innovations actually in that area where you can actually have these what's called a polyaphron dispersion technology. Fancy word. Basically, you can create these oil droplets that have a very stable structured shell, and you can put different ingredients in that shell, kind of like imagining putting one disgruntled parent in one shell and the other parent in another shell, but then putting the two of them together. What we saw is essentially a cream formulations now of the calcipotriene plus betamethasone dipropionate cream. That's been really helpful in terms of vehicle innovation that have brought these things forth. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the halobetazole propionate plus the tazarotene lotion, which was approved in 2019 for the treatment of plaque psoriasis. And having that tazarotene component in the topical combination treatment has been very helpful for patients who have thick plaques but very limited areas that it can able to penetrate very well into those areas and treat that. And we also saw the foam formulation of calcipotriene plus betamethasone. That's a third innovation in the last 10 years in the combination therapy that was approved in 2015, about 10 years ago. We saw its use in people with scalp psoriasis, for example.
As we wrap up, do you have any further thoughts on how we can get patients to use topical therapies better?
That is a great question. I think when I talk to my patients and I say that it's really the proactive treatment, I say that, if you treat it hard in the beginning and can get it to clear or almost clear, and then when you maintain it, you typically only have to use it twice a week. The optimal regimen, of course, is Monday and Thursday, but most people can't remember that. So I say, why don't you just use it on the weekends for maintenance? And overall, you actually may use less medication as a result of good maintenance. So I try to tell them it's kind of like a fire analogy in the forest. If you put it out early, you actually use much less water that you need to keep that fire quiescent and possibly extinguish it.
Awesome. Today, April and I discuss the use of topicals for psoriasis, including the new topicals that are available. It's an exciting time with these revolutionary internal medicines that are clearing people up who have horrible disease that we see ads on TV about. But the topicals are still valuable probably for the vast majority of people with psoriasis. And there's still extensive use of topical steroids, but we now have agents like topical tapinarof, topical roflumilast that help us avoid the downsides of topical steroids. And seeing they're good for other forms of inflammation like atopic dermatitis is good to know. So much of topical therapy revolves around the practical aspects, the messiness, but having these non-messy once daily dosing medications will certainly help us get our patients well. And with that, I thank you so much for joining us this season. This is Dr. Steve Feldman for In Discussion.
Thanks for listening to Medscape's In Discussion Psoriasis podcast series with our host, Dr. Stephen R. Feldman. Be sure to look for more In Discussion episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Check out medscape.com or the Medscape app for show notes, links, and more information on psoriasis.